What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G Pure and the Motorola Moto G 5G. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G Pure, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 80.6% screen-to-body ratio. With the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 81.4% screen-to-body ratio. So in general, these displays are actually really similar. Honestly, the only difference between the two is that with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 90Hz display, whereas the Moto G Pure has a standard 60Hz display. Other than that, they have the same resolution, same display technology, and in general, as far as quality goes, everything is going to look just about the same. Now, that being said, it's not really a bad thing, because for what they are, being really entry-level phones, their displays actually do look pretty good. Despite only having 720p resolutions, the images still look decently sharp, and the colors, brightness, and viewing angles are definitely not bad either. But again, really the only difference between these two displays is that with the Moto G 5G, with the 90Hz display versus a 60Hz display, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother, and while for the most part this is a pretty subtle difference, and you're not really going to notice it a whole lot, if you're doing a lot of content consumption like streaming videos, playing games, and that kind of thing, you will get a slightly better experience with the Moto G 5G. But again, in general, if you are looking for a really entry-level phone with a good display, then for what they are, you're really not going to go wrong with either phone. Now for storage, with the Moto G Pure, we're getting 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 256GB with microSD card expansion as well. So as you can see here, there is a huge difference. On one hand, with the Moto G Pure, honestly in this day and age, 32GB in my opinion really isn't even adequate, because even if you're more of a light user, stuff like apps, the system, and even just files in general are taking up more and more space, and 32GB, no matter what you're doing on your phone, is really going to fill up pretty quickly. On the other hand, with the Moto G 5G, 256GB is pretty much the most storage you're going to get in a phone that's not a flagship phone. So these phones are honestly two polar opposites when it comes to storage. So on one hand, if you're a really light user and you just need a phone for basic activities like sending text messages, maybe a little bit of web browsing and social media and stuff like that, but other than that, the only things you're going to be keeping on your phone are things like photos, videos, music, and that kind of stuff that can easily be offloaded onto a microSD card. In that case, the Moto G Pure will be okay, but in pretty much any other situation, if you are planning on having a decent number of apps on your phone, the Moto G 5G is going to have a huge advantage here. Now for security features, both of these phones have fingerprint scanners as well as face unlock. With the Moto G Pure, the fingerprint scanner is right here on the back, and with the Moto G 5G, it's right here on the power key. Honestly, when it comes to placement, there's really no right or wrong answer, and I personally really like both spots, but I feel like in general from what I've seen, having a fingerprint scanner on the power key is probably the most popular. But starting with the Moto G Pure, we're going to give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And moving on to the Moto G 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, and remember, both phones also have face unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Moto G Pure, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera, and this camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the Moto G Pure, we got a hole punch for the front facing camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. I do want to point out that between the two, as far as the design goes, I feel like the Moto G Pure does look a lot nicer and more modern, whereas with the water drop notch, on this phone it really doesn't look bad, but in general I feel like front facing cameras with the hole punch design do look a lot higher end. Now with the Moto G 5G, on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as features go, I would say both phones are pretty basic. Unfortunately, neither of them has an ultra-wide camera. And for video, both phones do have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so nothing really special there either. But that being said, neither camera is really bad per se. In between the two, the Moto G 5G will have a huge advantage, being able to take much higher quality photos. So if you are taking a lot of pictures, then the Moto G 5G will definitely be a better choice here. But if you're more of a casual camera user, if you're really just taking a couple photos every now and then, or maybe you're using something like Snapchat Snapchat for example, where the quality doesn't really matter a whole lot, and overall you just need a camera that's not terrible. In that case, while the Moto G 5G is a lot better, the Moto G Pure will still get the job done. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the Moto G Pure, we're getting 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G25 processor. With the Moto G 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700. Another thing to keep in mind here is that with the Moto G 5G, as the name suggests, this phone does get 5G connectivity, whereas with the Moto G Pure, this phone is 4G only. So if you do want 5G connectivity, then obviously between the two, the Moto G 5G is going to be the way to go. But if you don't really care about 5G connectivity, which I know not everyone does, then the Moto G Pure will still be perfectly fine. Personally, I feel like in this day and age, if you're going through the effort of getting a new phone, I feel like you might as well just get a 5G phone, because while 5G isn't really a necessity and 4G is not going away anytime soon, getting a phone with 5G connectivity is really going to future-proof your device, because after all, the 5G network is really the latest and greatest technology, and it's really only going to expand from here. But that being said, if you're not really concerned with getting the latest technology, and you really just need a basic phone for basic activities, then again, a 4G phone like the Moto G Pure is going to be perfectly fine. Now that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and as you can see here, there is a pretty huge difference in performance. With the Moto G Pure, we're getting a single core score of 133 and a multi-core score of 476, and with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a single core score of 545 and a multi-core score of 1684. So as you can see, between the two, the Moto G 5G is obviously going to have a huge advantage here. So if you're doing more demanding tasks like mobile gaming for example, or you're just going to be on your phone a lot, you're going to get a much better experience with the Moto G 5G. But again, if you're really just doing basic activities like making calls, sending text messages, and doing some light web browsing and social media use, the Moto G Pure will at least get the job done. Now for the batteries, with the Moto G Pure, we're getting a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging. With the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging as well. So in general, while the Moto G Pure doesn't really have a bad battery per se, the Moto G 5G does have a much larger battery. So with this phone, you are going to get significantly better battery life and longevity. So if having a phone with a large battery is a top priority for you, the Moto G 5G will be a much better choice. But on the other hand, if you're really not using your phone very heavily, the Moto G Pure will still at least get you through the day. And especially if you're in a situation where you have your phone plugged in most of the time, while of course a 4000 mAh battery is not going to have the same battery life as a 5000 mAh battery, the Moto G Pure will still get the job done. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? Honestly, in pretty much every way, the Moto G 5G is the better device here. The displays are really similar, there's not a huge advantage either phone has, except the Moto G Pure does have a higher refresh rate, so the movement on the screen again is going to be a little bit faster and smoother. The Moto G Pure also has so much more storage, with 256GB of internal storage versus only 32, and this is honestly probably one of the biggest differences here, because 32GB in almost any situation just really isn't enough, whereas 256GB is so much storage that for some people it's almost overkill. The Moto G 5G does have a significantly better camera, it also has a much faster processor, and it also has a larger battery as well. But all that being said, while the Moto G 5G is significantly better here, you probably already knew that going into this video, because after all, the Moto G 5G is a much higher end phone than the Moto G Pure. So in general, the real question here is, which phone actually makes the most sense for you? Overall, of course, if you're doing higher end activities, you're taking lots of photos, you have a lot of apps, and you're just going to be on your phone a lot, in that situation, of course, the Moto G 5G is going to be a much better choice here. But on the other hand, if you're really just a light user, and you really just need something for the basics, like sending text messages, making calls, you just need a camera that works, and you're not too concerned about taking really high quality photos or using fancy features, and in general, you really just need a phone to use as a phone and not a whole lot else. In that kind of situation, the Moto G Pure is still going to get the job done, and since this phone is a lot more affordable than the Moto G 5G, if you're really not going to be using a whole lot of features, you're probably going to get a lot more value for the money with the Moto G Pure than you will with the Moto G 5G. So that's definitely something to think about there. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G Pure and the Motorola Moto G 5G. Once again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipas Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.